Yo, welcome to my ranking of Armored Core 6's major bosses from worst to best, using these tiers on screen. And I really want to put emphasis on the fact that this is just my ranking, based on how I personally played the game. You could theoretically make a super dumb build that lets you beat any boss without even moving your character, but that's not how I played the game. So keep in mind, what's good and what's fun is extremely subjective in this game. And I should also mention that this is my first time playing an Armored Core game, so I apologize if series standards or references go unnoticed. But what will not go unnoticed is the sponsor of today's video, and that is Bloodline: Heroes of Lythus, which is a dark fantasy hero collector RPG that has some of the most unique gacha gameplay I think I've ever seen. With its innovative Ayre system and breathtaking visuals, Bloodline takes RPGs and gacha gameplay to a whole new level. And the best part is, it's completely free to play, and I've got the QR code on screen for you to scan if you're on PC, and a link in the description of this video. As for why I'm calling it a unique take on the usual gacha gameplay, let's have a look at that. Well, there's the Ayre system, as I mentioned, that allows you to customize your champions by marrying any two bloodlines of elves, orcs, dwarves, etc. There's a ton of races, to create over 4,000 hybrids of fantasy races. And yes, that does mean that those characters have children, which you can then use for strategic purposes as the hybrids inherit the talents and traits of their parents. Not to mention their appearance is also passed down from each family tree and fused into one. So there's a lot of cool customization that's made all the better with great 3D graphics. There's also fun PvP elements to be found in the seasonal guild wars, where you can earn uniquely designed hybrid champions called Bloodcraft Legends. Another aspect that keeps the game fresh is constant updates. There's new bloodlines with unique abilities being released every 2 weeks, the newest one being Tide Races, powerful demigods from, you guessed it, the ocean. So go ahead and get the game for free on both Android and iOS using my link in the description or by scanning the QR code. Why? Because you'll get a sweet starter pack with a value of $20. And also the first 30 people to leave their account ID and username in the pinned comment below will get a free legendary quality succubus champion, the Luxuriant. I know you weirdos want it.
Few can resist the allure of the succubi.
So thank you for the sponsorship, Bloodline, and let's get back to Armored Core 6. I've been making boss rankings for a while on YouTube, and I think this is the first time ever that I'm starting the ranking from as high as the decent tier. That's what the tiers are for, because if I just said the helicopter is the worst boss, it would paint a pretty negative picture, but that's not really how I feel about this guy. This is a fine tutorial boss, albeit it's unfortunate and funny how it wound up filtering a lot of people from getting past the first mission. I can't wrap my head around that. I feel if you've ever played any game before, this should be beatable. Maybe my mom or my grandma wouldn't get past it, but I think that's about the extent of it. But I guess not. I did die once and then again on my replay, so it's not a complete pushover, especially since you've barely had any time to get comfortable with the game mechanics at the start. And this is the one and only boss you can't outbuild with a ridiculous setup, because everyone has to fight it with the same toolkit: a rifle, pulse blade, and homing missiles. They fare well against it, but don't outright annihilate it. But that's also kind of the issue. Armored Core 6 is all about testing out different builds and whatnot, and this boss lacks that depth. I also don't like how it can exit the combat zone while still shooting at you, especially given how the pulse blade is what does the most damage to it. But you need to get up close to use it. Nothing really bad besides that, so it's a low decent tier fight for me. So is this a boss fight or a level? Both. But which does it excel more at? I'd say more in level than in boss fight. But it's one hell of a level, I'll tell you what. First of all, it looks amazing silhouetted in the distance with all the dust and shit. Absolutely beautiful, and to make sure you don't stop looking at it, it periodically fires lasers that are dangerously precise. Then you break the Strider's leg and climb aboard, no cutscenes involved. It just falls down and you can fly up and dismantle its turrets and sub-generators. It's easy to forget that the ACs you operate are actually the size of buildings when you feel so tiny up against a mechanical colossus like this. Once the generators are gone, you're up against the final obstacle, the Eye. I wish it was a good fight. I know a stationary thing like this is tricky to turn into anything other than a target dummy, but that's what it is, and that's a bit of a pity. But it doesn't ruin the vision of what they were going for. No pun intended. The spectacle of destroying a city-sized machine. Juggernaut is another early game boss, and thus, it's also light on build experimentation. But it's not really something you'll need, because this fight is extremely easy with whatever you're using. For the first half of it at least. Juggernaut's only weak point is at the back, but thanks to your buddy Rusty aggroing the boss, that's not much of a concern. You basically have free access to it. That is, of course, until Rusty is called off and the boss is left entirely to you. Now all of a sudden it's a real fight. At first I mostly struggled because I was sure the idea was to bait the boss to ram at you, dodge it and then shoot it before it turns around, but the Juggernaut is too well prepared for that. It instantly turns around and starts shooting. What it's not prepared for though is aerial combat. This way not only is it easy to get a vantage point of the back of the boss, but you also avoid the mines on the ground. So I guess it's nice that this boss puts more emphasis on positioning and whatnot, but I never looked back at the fight with super fond memories. It was just a fine, decent enough boss. This boss is conceptually and design-wise really cool. It's a giant Roomba with a volcano attached to it, as well as giant shredding machines it uses to punch and crush you to death with. But like Juggernaut, it doesn't really know what to do if you start flying around it. Its fists won't reach you, so the only slight concern is the fireballs coming out of the furnace. But if you just don't stay right above it, they most of the time won't reach you. This is dangerous, and this is dangerous, but this is cakewalk. I think this boss gets easily forgotten partially because of its placement. It comes right after Balteus and right before Sea Spider, both of which are insane difficulty spikes, whereas the Cleaner just feels like a small step up from the Juggernaut. I'd say this boss is right around the top of decent tier and the bottom of good. CATAPHRACT isn't exactly a crazy multi-phase boss, but more like a really well done mini-boss. He's kind of a glass cannon, but that works for him since his weak spot, the very front of the tank, isn't all that easy to hit. Not just because it's a small target, but because the boss is very mobile, constantly zooming from one side of the snowfield to the other, which makes the fight feel fast-paced and thrilling. As for his attacks, he has pretty much non-stop fireworks going on, but only one of them really requires more than just side strafing, and that's the laser cannon, of course. If you're gonna be a one-trick pony, that's a good trick to rely on, because I can't for the life of me avoid it consistently. He can supercharge it up as well, but that makes it actually easier to avoid for me. It's a fun fight for sure, but again, since it's more of a mini-boss, I don't want to rank it too high. There's two distinct early to mid-game roadblocks in Armored Core 6, I think, and this is one of them. I was stuck here for a good couple of hours, and it was a miserable time for me. Thing is, I'm used to spending a lot of time on a boss, that's kinda my thing here on YouTube, but there was an unusual amount of salt on my end. I felt I died more often because I couldn't see or process what was going on, rather than because of any one attack being too hard to avoid. And just not knowing what's going on isn't really my favorite type of difficulty. Besides that, I think the main challenge is figuring out where you should be hanging out at. At distance you'll have a tough time avoiding the big lasers and the melee slams, but up close you'll be in greater danger of what I'm gonna call passive attacks. Most bosses have these constant rapid-firing shots that you're probably not going to avoid 100%, and it's more about mitigating as much of that damage as possible. They're like filler moves in between big attacks that go beep beep. If you're just constantly moving to one side while at a distance from the boss, you'll probably avoid most of the passive attacks. However, if you're up close, that's not as likely, and eating up all of it will quickly build up a shit ton of damage. So basically there's no real safe areas with the Sea Spider, but generally just being up close to the boss and nuking the shit out of it is what works the best. It's too big and slow to be able to dodge big explosives and melee strikes, so it went from ridiculous chaos to instant kill, and it never hit that sweet spot of being somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. But maybe that's the appeal to some people, just finding the right build. But despite all that, I do think it's a good boss. Very much feels like a different kind of machine than what you're used to fighting, and I think the out-of-place music really emphasizes that. And Phase 2 was a fun surprise. It suddenly takes off and becomes a flying pinecone, even if it is by far the easiest part of the fight. But I guess it's good practice for a certain other encounter. Iceorm is this game's spectacle gimmick fight, and I don't know the history of these types of bosses in Armored Core, but I'm well familiar with them in FromSoft Souls-like games. I don't think this is their best one yet, but I think it's far from their worst. The design of the boss itself isn't super detailed, and the spectacle comes more from its size and how it moves underground, as well as the coral shit everywhere. But by far the coolest thing in this entire fight is the countdown to Rusty firing a super laser from God knows where he is. Somehow that makes me more tense than anything the boss does. It's like the fucking Oppenheimer Trinity countdown.
100, 110, 115, roll cannon engaging output. All or nothing.
Another plus side is the fact that this is a big story moment with lots of distinct characters temporarily working together, and their interactions are fun to listen to.
Pretty me up there, freelancer. Not so smug, no, you don't. first.
The goal is fairly simple. You shoot the boss in the mouth with the anti-ice worm weapon, it disables its shield, then Rusty snipes it and you can wail on the boss. Then repeat with small elements of danger escalating as it goes along. Not my favorite gimmick gameplay wise, it feels kinda up to luck if the boss is kind enough to stay still for long enough for the cannon to hit it. The boss's attacks do a lot of damage to compensate how easy most of them are to avoid, but I still feel like the fight could have intensified more towards the end. By this point most of your companions will have left, but that doesn't really matter. The boss isn't very good at physically hitting you anyway, so who cares about aggro? And the start of the fight is very bare of anything interesting mechanically. It takes a while for the fight to get interesting. Still, it succeeds overall in being a memorable, cool looking part of the game, so I think good tier is appropriate. The Enforcer is effectively an anti-Magicat boss. It's like it was built to specifically counter everything I've relied on thus far in the game. My go-to weapons are shotguns, miniguns and big grenade cannons. These are all extremely effective at medium and close range, but that's where you're at the most danger in this fight. The Enforcer's Bubble Blaster has a lot of tracking, so hugging the boss will get you staggered quick. Not to mention the crazy melee combos that can keep you stun locked. You wanna get the fuck out of the way of those. And you have to keep constantly moving just to avoid the passive attacks, so big explosives aren't ideal if you want to keep that mobility. But hey, I did say that testing out builds and customizing your loadout is what Armored Core 6 is all about, so I'm not gonna sit here and say that it's a bad thing this boss made me think twice about what weaponry to use. Not to the point where changing the build is the key to beating the boss, it's still a pretty tough fight regardless. So for that reason it was a more satisfying challenge to overcome in comparison to Sea Spider. I had to learn how to dodge that blade. I could tell what was going on, it was just hard to execute. There's also phase 2, which makes the already deadly melee combos even scarier as the boss now has shockwaves and grabs. That makes it all the more satisfying when you do dodge them. It's almost a great tier boss, but I'm not sure if it's special enough for that. It feels more like an upgraded version of your typical AC fights. It's as close to great tier as a good boss can be. Walter is one of many ACs you fight in the game, which are enemies that share the same model, moves and weapons as you, and I've had a long history of always hating those types of fights in other FromSoft games, but I think this shows that doesn't have to be the case. Generally the ACs are fun to fight, and I can't quite explain why they work and the player model enemies don't in Souls-like games. Maybe it's just the combat system, but in Walter's case it's definitely the presentation. You're forced to fight your own handler who's been experimented on, or something, by Arquebus, re-educated as they say, and you're tossling on top of a massive city ship that's about to crash land into a planet. It's kinda sad seeing him in this state when the rest of the game he's always sounded cool and confident.
Look at you, 621. You found a friend.
As for his toolkit, it stands out quite a bit from all the other ACs. He's using coral weapons with lots of beams and explosives. With some other ACs it feels like you can just stun lock them to death and tank all the damage without needing to dodge, but that's not the case here. Those beams demand your attention. So from now on I will use this boss as the gold standard for player model bosses. I think this might end up being the hottest take of the video. Snail Balteus is an awesome fight, and I think gameplay wise I might even prefer it over the original Balteus. So far I've seen some people calling it the worst boss in the game, most agreeing that it's Balteus but worse, and not much beyond that. Most common complaint being the shield, the short amount of time it remains disabled, and how much health the boss has. But as you can see in the footage, there's obviously a way around that. I never had any issue with it. At first I did feel like the boss was just spamming every attack in the game at me, but if you take the time to learn it all, it's actually really well designed I think. The plasma shots leave a lingering trail that will do damage if you touch it, so not only do you need to dodge the initial attack, but also make sure you won't end up accidentally going through the trail. And with the bubble, sometimes he'll unleash a big wave of it that you'll need to use vertical movement to avoid. All that shit, I really like. And then in phase 2 he activates his desperation move, and it is one of the scariest, coolest and most fun combos in the game. Not only do the beams reach as far as the eye can see, and not only do they do a lot of damage, and not only does the combo last forever, but they also leave plasma clouds everywhere that will then fucking explode. And you're somehow supposed to survive all this. Figuring this move out was so much fun, and I've got it down perfectly now. Another thing superior about Snail Balteus is, well, Snail. He's an actual character, and one you more than likely despise. I love his voice acting, there's just utter contempt in every word he utters.
That traitor V4, those dolts at command, and worst of all, you, the pest of Rubicon who stirred the cinders. You sicken me, all of you. I am Arquebus.
So I hope I'll make some people reassess this boss and try it again. Maybe you'll enjoy it. Balteus is an autonomous PCA craft. Did you know that?
It's an autonomous PCA craft.
Did you know it's called Balteus?
Balteus.
And that you have to break its pulse armor to inflict meaningful damage?
You'll have to break its pulse armor to inflict meaningful damage.
Did you get that? Did you? Seriously, shut the fuck up, lady, in my ear! If you were to tell me that Balteus would be in great tier and in the top 5 when I was first fighting it, I probably wouldn't believe you. This is a make or break boss. Either you bend to the will of the game mechanics, or you break. I was stuck on the mentality that every attack should and would be dodgeable, and it's just about finding out how to do it. But with Balteus, I was up against something else entirely. No matter how hard I tried, I could never completely dodge the missile salvo. And I just refuse to accept that. I need to dodge everything. But it's not about that, it's about mitigating as much of it as possible and then focusing on the stuff you can fully avoid, like the single rockets or flames in Phase 2. Not to mention that this is the first time when your build and loadout actually matters, to the point that certain weapons are just garbage at this boss. You need something that can destroy pulse defenses. But after hours of being bent, broken, destroyed, it somehow just finally clicked. There is more to it than just tanking damage. You should generally try to stay to the side of the boss where you're at less risk of getting hit by the machine gun, shotgun and rocket launchers. And I just like the way it's animated. I don't know, it looks really smooth and like it's a real, functioning ship. To me, this boss has better spectacle than the Ice Worm, despite being 100 times smaller. And Phase 2 is obviously the best part. It's using flamethrowers, like swords, and to also punish hiding at the side of the boss, so that's good. I think I overall very slightly prefer this version over Snail because it feels more like it's a boss with, I don't know, design clarity? Snail felt more like an afterthought, whereas here the techno music, the rain and the look of the missile porcupine moves all just click together perfectly. Ibis is the most FromSoft boss I've ever seen. I almost forget I'm playing Armored Core, dude is like a Malekith wannabe. But I think what's special about this boss is how well woven the passive attacks are. They don't feel like just filler moves, they're an integral part of the rhythm of the dogfight. But if I'm gonna complain about annoying dialogue that gets repeated every time you fight a boss, I think this might be the worst case of it.
Listen up, 621. The Ibis series are no ordinary weapon. They're designed to prevent security. 621! 621! Shut up! I'll shut you all up!
I got so fed up hearing exposition every time I reset the fight that I turned off voice volume. But then I forgot to turn it back on for the following cutscene and I had no idea what happened. So that pissed me off. Underneath the overload of exposition is a fantastic agile boss that I have nothing but praise for, particularly the second phase. That's what I mean when I say it's the most FromSoft boss ever. Of course it comes back to life. And not only are all the new moves cool as hell, but some of the existing ones are recontextualized. The Malekith projectiles he did in Phase 1 now have to be dodged at close range, which is brutal, but fair. You've already seen the move, that was practice, this is the exam. Even though this is an automated flying machine, it feels almost like a knight-type boss with the melee strikes, and the lasers kinda resemble blades. It's like, what if we took the best type of boss from Souls and turned it into a fighter jet? But the thing that makes this feel fresh in spite of that is that you have an entire dimension more to worry about. You don't just dodge left and right, you also have altitude to worry about. Some moves you have to fly over. I love that. Also, gotta say, when I first saw this move right here, I just laughed because it was so good. As much as she annoyed me in unrelated fights, I felt like a monster killing Ayre. But unfortunately for her, since then I've killed her like 50 more times because this fight is addicting. The only weak part is the first little chunk of her health. At that point her only direct attack is the blade swings, so mostly you're just dealing with her passive attacks that aren't very engaging to go up against. They punish aggression, but you need aggression to counter her coral shield, so not the best dynamic. But I do love the blade strikes. Armored Core doesn't have iframe dodges, so I find it impressive how well dodging through the swings works. After she's taken some damage, she begins using her special moves, and her special moves are by far the most fun in the game. She can transition from the regular blade swings into slow beams, and turn into a fighter jet and fly right at you. Sound design in that attack is great. That move becomes even cooler in the second form, where she copies herself into an entire squadron of fighter jets that kamikaze into the ground, while she herself unleashes a super laser. Again, like with Ibis, I feel the effect of having a third dimension to worry about, height, gives every move so much more depth. Like when she summons 2 copies of herself that strike at you, it's best to fly above them and then dodge behind Ayre as she comes for the finishing move. And finally, I think there's the emotional stakes that elevate this even further. I like when bosses talk to you, that's when dialogue-filled fights work. I only don't like it when it's just characters explaining what's going on and it adds nothing to the battle. There's no reason for that dialogue to play more than once. But here it really drives home her desperation that's complemented with a beautiful soundtrack and good voice acting.
I realize what you are. The spark of war. The fires that haunt Rubicon. Your fire must die. I'll end this, Raven.
I think she's my favorite boss, and the most fun boss, but I have to acknowledge that there's another boss that has even more going for it. But I will warn you right now, it's the true ending boss, and you need to do New Game Plus Plus to get to it. Don't let me ruin it for you. Go do New Game Plus, it's absolutely worth it, even without the final boss. Okay, 3, 2, 1. I laughed my ass off when I realized the final boss is fucking Iguazu of all people. Granted, he's fused with All Might and other vengeful grunts. First you fight a gang squad of little ACs led by him. I don't like this part a whole lot, if at all. The little helpers aren't hard or too annoying to dispatch, but Iguazu's AC, that's the problem. He's non-stop turtling behind a shield while backing away from you, so you're constantly chasing him, until he starts spamming plasma that kind of forces you to back away. It's not hard, it just feels irritating and there's no fun mechanics that you have to deal with. It feels like a group of regular enemies. At the very least, it is satisfying to do like 70% of the boss's health in one hit when you get the chance. Then, the real fight begins. It's a rehash of Ayre mixed in with 2 flying sea spiders. You do have her fighting alongside you, but you're still outnumbered. So is this a fair and balanced gank? Yeah, mostly. FromSoft has finally made a synchronized gank boss where it's not just independently functioning AIs doing whatever they want, wherever they want. Instead, you'll often have both sea spiders doing lasers simultaneously, while All Might / Iguazu is flying high out of harm's way. Then after the sea spiders are done with their thing, All Might comes back with a slash followed up by a big ol' beam. Even though you can't always keep all 3 targets on screen at the same time, there are the red arrows indicating where the attacks are coming from, as well as the beeps. So it actually most of the time works, and creates some really amazing moments. But not always. Sometimes I go, what? What hit me? Especially the spinny move the sea spiders do, it doesn't work well with this fight. It's a giant, but mostly controllable mess. But forget all that, because phase 3 is the real fight. This is when Iguazu sort of breaks free of All Might's control and becomes independent, with the sole goal of killing you. I haven't talked about his character yet, but Iguazu is ridiculous. He's been a complete dick the entire game, and he just won't stop coming after you. Dude refuses to die out of sheer salt. And it is a little bit comical, but I think thematically this is the perfect final boss for this game. The way I see it, this game is all about agency, free will to make choices. Iguazu resents us because he's jealous we are an independent freelancer. So much so that even when fused with all these other voices, under All Might's control, he manages to break free out of sheer willpower, out of the human flaw of jealousy. And he puts up a fight like none other. This is by fucking far the hardest boss in the game. He's replaced the cute blade strikes that you could simply move through with these Wolverine claws that are too wide to be dodged through. Instead, you have to fly up at the right time and then dodge in the right direction while mid-air. And it gets more and more complicated when you mix in all his crazy combos with their own demanding patterns. This is the culmination of the 3-dimensionally challenging moves I've been talking about. It's so well done, it's so intense, and so rewarding when you pull it off right. This phase alone is one of FromSoft's greatest creations.
I always envied you. The freelancer who had it all.
That and everything else I've been talking about is just based on my own experience. Maybe some of you don't even think about dodging the shit and you just use pulse bucklers instead. And fair enough, I'm interested to hear how your experiences differ from mine. But if it wasn't clear enough, I love Armored Core 6. This is a game I didn't ask for, I didn't want, but now that it's here, I am so grateful for it. I hope that love shows in this video. Hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching. And of course, don't forget about checking out Bloodline Heroes of Lythus if it seemed interesting to you. Link and QR code and pinned comment in the description and blah 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 blah. You get it.